All right, everybody. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to the Decisions at the Speed of Now webinar. This is going to be a discussion about bank account validation and how it's evolving. The goal of this discussion is going to be to give you some context, talk a little bit about the problem, the market, kind of what's driving this, and then jump right into an industry leader's perspective. I'll introduce him and the rest of us here in just a minute. So we'll do some introductions in a moment, but again, what we'll do is we'll outline some of the challenges that businesses, leaders, lenders and consumers have, how they're navigating those. And then we'll talk a little bit about at Accelitas what we have found as some of the key tools for solving this challenging issue. And then most importantly is really letting one of our clients give his perspective on what he sees as the challenge and his way of solving this. So without further ado, we'll move on to introductions. So my name is Jimmy Williams. I'm going to be your host for today. I lead the sales and client team here at Accelitas. My background is I am a payments geek. I have been in the industry for about 20 years in large payments companies. And I spent a little bit of time in a very, very large bank on the consumer side of things. And accompanying me is, and I'm based in Philadelphia, and accompanying me is Steve Krozik, who is our CTO and head of data science at Accelitas. And Steve, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Steve Krozik. My background is in a lot of computer vision, machine learning. I started with biometrics, moved to different government applications, and been with Accelitas for quite a while, and moving up to leading the team here.
Awesome. And Steve's based in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
That's right.
And then if you already know Accelitas and work with us, thanks for joining today. We appreciate your business, and we promise to work hard every day to continue to earn your business. If you don't work with us, what I'll tell you is that at our core, Accelitas is a data analytics company, and we believe in using the transformative power of data to provide fast, fair, and frictionless financial access. And if I said that without tripping on all those F's, then it's going to be okay today. So now let me introduce you to our guest. So if you already work in the lending and specialty finance space, Ryan Barrett is probably somebody who you already know or know of. Without question, he is a powerhouse of knowledge and experience. I've personally known Ryan for, I guess, about 2.5 years or so. I don't know that I know anyone, or at least many people, who bring the level of energy and curiosity to every single discussion. So love having you here today, Ryan, and certainly let you introduce yourself, give your background.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was quite nice of you. Hey guys, I'm Ryan. I've been at ACIMA for 5 or 6 years. My hair doesn't look like that anymore. I have a man bun now thanks to COVID, but I'm ready to do this webinar. So
awesome. Thanks, Ryan. All right, so today's topic again is bank account validation. This is a topic that's really become a priority strategy for a lot of clients for a couple of different reasons. One of the biggest reasons has been a need to either detect or reduce fraud that's in their environment, whether they are a lender, whether they're a business, you name it. Second is a need to predict creditworthiness using a bank account. That's a big part of what we do here. And then third is certainly regulatory requirements. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Many people probably are aware of the Nacha web debit rule, and that's sort of lit a fire for a lot of folks. Talk a little bit about just kind of, the numbers and what's happening out there. So the growth of digital transactions, that is non-face-to-face transactions, is just without question staggering. And as Ryan said, while it's changed hairstyles, it's also changed a lot of dynamics of how we interact as consumers. People who've never used DoorDash before suddenly are probably ordering a couple times a week. So in a non-face-to-face environment, there's just plenty of opportunities for fraud. And if you come from a payments background, you know that when some of these fraud tools get introduced on the face-to-face side, they migrate to the non-face-to-face side. Non-face-to-face side just provides a lot of opportunities for that to happen. And the challenges are that, a lot of these legacy fraud tools and mitigation tools, and as we talk about bank account validation, they miss a changing demographic entirely. So that's just a huge gap, is that from a population standpoint, it's just not there. Some of the newer technology, seems like it's something that would be like, oh gosh, this really gets us there, but it suffers a really high abandon rate based on the user experience and just by the virtue of how it operates. So, so it's really kind of an interesting conundrum, and we'll talk about that. And then, really, in this crazy twist of irony, you have this situation where digital transactions lack that personal connection of interacting between two human beings, but there's a ton of additional underlying or back-end data that can be incredibly useful and helpful if you have access to it and if you can use it in the correct way. So what you see here is really kind of just an overlay of what I would describe as the 5 different flavors of bank account validation as they exist today. So, consistent theme that you see here in that top row, friction, is that just about all of them suffer from a high degree of friction in some form or another. The first 3 of these, manual verification, ACH pre-noting, and micro deposits, all 3 of those are what I would describe as, very legacy technologies where, it pretty much all but is eliminating the opportunity for immediate gratification and real-time access. Something has to happen on the outside, then that user has to come back. So there's just a high potential for, for abandonment at that point. And then, someone asked the question actually as we were prepping, I don't know if anybody heard this, but the difference between, pre-noting and micro depositing. But, in a pre-noting environment, you're typically talking, a payroll situation. So, trying to hit an account and making sure that the bank responds that, hey, this account's in good standing. Micro deposits really engaging a consumer. So sending small deposits to a consumer account, letting the consumer validate those transactions came through. The last column, bank login, this is anecdotally also known as OLB, or online banking credential use. So if you see that in the rest of the terminology here, or if we mention that, that's what we're talking about. It can be real time. However, needing to know your username and your password for your online banking account access is criteria. So a lot of people like me probably have biometric access to that. So I have no idea what my username and password is, but I just use my finger to access it. And then there's the other aspect of handing that information over to a third party. And then the 4th column, databases, they don't suffer from the friction issue. So they all but alleviate that issue, but the database has to be extensive. It has to offer the right amount of coverage. Otherwise, you're going to suffer an issue of not getting what you need out of the service. And that takes us to our first polling question. So you'll see this pop up here in a second. We'd love to hear your feedback on how do you currently validate bank accounts. I'll just give you a couple seconds. All right. And it looks like 67% of respondents said database verification, and then kind of a tie here from micro deposits and bank login. So interesting. Not terribly surprising. The micro deposits, I guess, were more surprising to me than the rest. Right. So now we talk about the kind of the 3 big issues, the 3 big concerns. So the first, which I sort of gave you the crumbs to already, which is that lack of coverage. So you've got a changing population out there, different demographics. And if you're only verifying a certain portion of those customers because they come from certain financial institutions that are covered, or from a certain geography, or you're just missing a bunch of them, that's an issue. You've got to come up with a secondary process for the what if, what's my plan B of how do I find everybody else that's on there. The second, an increase in fraud that's happening out there is, if you think about it this way, account takeover fraud, synthetic fraud, first-party fraud. These are all big issues that are facing lenders, utilities, businesses today. So finding a way to look for, is there a better radar sweep that I can get of what's happening with these accounts? And then last but certainly not least is that we've had the catalyst for a lot of people looking into this, the Nacho web debit rule, undeniably. However, there's a lot of other reasons in play of how do I navigate this issue but do it the right way? And it brings us to our second polling question. What is your current coverage rate for account validation? Okay. Okay, so it looks like, wow, somebody answered 10%. And then 60 and 70% is about the norm. So that kind of matches up with my experience of what we hear from a lot of clients as well. So let's talk about coverage. So this is really the most common issue that we hear from customers just in the world, just in general, is that there is a widely used and heavily in use bank consortium of data that's out there and available. And that coverage rate averages about 60 to 70% when tested is kind of what we see and what our clients report. The other aspect of that is that it is not real-time data. So if a bank reported that information and it's on file, that's great, and that certainly could be helpful, but it doesn't necessarily indicate or provide direct access to, hey, this is exactly what's going on out there. So while a database is the most commonly used aspect, you have kind of two core issues. Is that you have this big population that's not getting hit, and then you have this secondary issue that the data that you're getting may not be the freshest that you have. So you end up with this kind of patchwork of mitigation. Ryan, I'm going to put you on the spot. I know you feel pretty passionate about this issue as a big challenge. Anything you'd like to add?
Yes. So I was part of the 60 to 70% group, a year ago. I have been successively piecing together pieces of bank account verification, and I pretty much hit a limit until I found you guys, which has really helped in adding the additional coverage. So like you mentioned, coverage is everything for bank account. When you are trying to let people through, you want to maximize your top of funnel. And to do that, you need to have the best possible bank account verification coverage product. So, and one of those does not, I have not seen one. So let's get one going.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So then sort of the second piece is, on the legal and regulatory side of things, I mentioned the Nacho web debit rule. If you're not aware of the Nacho web debit rule, it was enacted and went into place last March. And that's caused a lot of energy to be expended in the space as people need to now go through a process to screen for fraud with bank accounts that they're using. So a lot of activity associated with that. The second is that banks and their regulators have been really focused on these online banking credential use providers out there. If you haven't seen it, there was a public, publicly available information at this point. Plaid recently settled a very significant lawsuit associated with privacy aspects of online banking credential use with their service. So the big banks have been very curiously looking at this because in essence it's third parties looking at consumer data, and the use of that data, the derivatives of that data, present some interesting conundrums, the rights to that data. So lots of things to kind of navigate there. I won't go too much further down that path. And then last but not least, we have a new administration in, and we've seen a already much more active CFPB. We expect that trend to continue. So as you think about practices, use of a lot of this data and lending, you've got to do it the right way. And you want to make sure that whatever you're employing as your process is one that's going to stand the test of time. So enough about the issue itself. how to solve this issue. And then really we see kind of three key paths here. The first, which is really what Ryan said, is improving that coverage and the signal ratio. So improving the coverage, get a lot more coverage overall, and then make sure that in getting that extensive coverage, that what you're getting out of it is a lot more meaningful. Those two can be independent, and so solving both of them at the same time, critically important. The second is that, especially for lenders, the timeliness of having a great user experience that you can decision off of is enormous. So, using a bank account validation process where you can get a real-time response that you can make a decision on and that you can adverse action on is incredibly helpful. And then last but not least is constant improvement. And I know Steve will talk about this. I believe Ryan will talk about this as well, but setting it and forgetting it is not an acceptable process. Monitoring, making sure that you're getting the desired results, challenging those results, looking for, is there a better way to do this? Is this tailored to the goal you're trying to achieve? These are the three keys that we have seen as being successful criteria. So then rather than, and the concept we have is, rather than focus on just what the banks are reporting, look at where the bank accounts are being used is really kind of our mindset, right? So if you look at just the bank accounts, then you really suffer from that scenario of kind of a single lens. What the bank is reporting, what cadence are they reporting it in? Is it still accurate? Is it inaccurate? Are the customers that you're looking at representative of those banks? If you instead take the opposite view and say, where are these bank accounts being used, you get a lot more information. So, somebody grocery shopping in person, somebody ordering something online, somebody paying their water bill, all those provide signal. And that signal and that information, the underlying data associated with that can be incredibly powerful when it comes to not just bank account validation, but using that same information to really predict credit. And that's one of the things Ryan will talk about. So using data that's uncorrelated with traditional credit scores and credit sources, but predictive of credit outcomes has really been what we have found been the key success factor from a data standpoint. And then I'm going to turn it over to Steve, who's going to talk a little bit more about the custom tailored solution that part of our mindset.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Yep.
So I'll go over, one possible approach that we've worked with Ryan on to address the issues Jimmy was talking about. We have thin file applicants, we have the not your debit rule, and any fraud that's coming through. So the common goal through this solution is you want to balance between data costs, friction, and then the losses. So there's two extremes. You can have one extreme where you can subject all the transactions through an expensive credentialed service. That'll minimize loss, but you're going to incur high abandonments and high data costs. And the other extreme on the other side would be to do minimal verification, where you can incur large losses and then possibly not be in compliance with not just rules. So a way to balance that out is to use a waterfall approach like we show here that does various levels of bank account verification, and you do only what's necessary at that risk. So at the top of the service, or at the top of the waterfall, you'll do what we call screening, where you do routing and account number checks that can be done with various levels of precision based on what algorithm you're using and what back end of data you have. Next level would be a scoring level where you're basically risk ranking the applicants into different buckets. And you can treat those different buckets differently based on what risk you incur from those applications. Next level would be to validate them. So you're looking at more precise data about the account itself, where if you're answering the question, does the account exist? Is it open? Will it allow ACH transactions? Or even kind of deeper, does it have sufficient funds to process a particular transaction? And then the final level of the waterfall, where Revive here kind of falls into, we're filling in the no hits. We're filling in the empty space that we might have not had from a previous provider that another secondary service is filling in. So this slide describes two tools we've developed that take different approaches to account validation. So both services, like Jimmy mentioned, are non-credentialed. On the left side, you have the input where you only need the bank and routing number, or bank account number and routing number. The first service is meant to be an inexpensive call that will do validation of the routing number and account number along with the risk ranking. So it kind of solves those first two levels of screening and scoring, and where you can put it into buckets. So, this service makes a lot of sense at the top of the waterfall, where you can quickly and cheaply remove invalid inputs if they're fat fingering accounts or not putting their leading zeros in. And then also ones that pass that, you can segment them based on risk and treat them differently. The second service, where we call AAI Verified Bank Data Plus, is more precise. It's FCA compliant, and it looks at transaction details from that specific account. And what this allows us to do is to validate the account exists, is open, and accepts ACH transactions. So this service makes a whole lot of sense at lower parts of the waterfall where you need a precise verification and answer about that specific account. So just a little bit about how we develop our services. This slide kind of goes into what we do. And one of the big things we do with our team is we take a multidisciplinary approach, which just means we take techniques from computer vision, deep learning, natural language processing, basic statistics, and signal processing, and we put them all together. And this allows me to have a team that has experience from a wide range of disciplines, and we can kind of select the tools and techniques that best fit the problem under whatever constraints we're under. So a couple areas I wanted to highlight was semi-supervised learning has been super useful to us recently, where we can leverage large amounts of unlabeled data to then make more precise predictions regarding bank accounts. The other area that's had a lot of work done recently is model interpretability, or explaining the model's predictions. So what that allows us to do is allows us to leverage very, very powerful, complex models that also provide meaningful outputs that can be interpreted. And then finally, what this figure is showing is the keys to the success with our solutions and work with Ryan here has been a continuous feedback loop, where our customers will provide us the outcomes of what happens after they leverage our service. So that data is used to first monitor. So we have a continuously monitoring of what our service is doing for our customer. And then also it will refine the model dynamically. So that's what's visualized here. And so, what we've seen with everything going on, we're continuously changing customer populations and, what's going on with kind of the environment. This feedback loop will allow us to update the models without them drifting too far in performance. And so, I'd like to hand it over to Ryan from ACIMA, who's been kind of working hand in hand with us pretty closely on a lot of the workflow I've described here. So over to you, Ryan.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't think I have a necessarily unique use case. Like I mentioned, our coverage, or ACIMA's coverage back in the day, was around 70%. We added additional layers, got it maybe up to 80, 85%, but we were pretty much stuck there. So the Accelitas team came and talked to me, and we wanted to try adding Accelitas as an additional layer to our bank account verification process. Now, at ACIMA, bank account verification happens at the top of the waterfall. It's required to get a lease with us. That means, like I mentioned, that coverage is everything. So what we're running into is with that 85%, the 15% unknowns generally would tend to actually be good consumers. Their bank accounts may be at a credit union or a non-reporting regional bank. So what we ended up doing was leveraging the Accelitas score to actually remap those unknowns. And we did it both for the unknowns and then later for the denials. And so effectively, that was part of the revive section that Steve was talking about on one of the other previous slides. But what that allowed us to do is you see the risk before, and then you see the risk after. And so what we're doing by remapping is making that unknown population as small as possible. So I don't really know what's on the next slide, but maybe next slide. Nope, okay, I'll just keep talking on the original slide. So anyway, Steve and I worked pretty closely together to develop what this process would be. And we did it initially with what's called a retro. So we, ACIMA, sent Accelitas. I don't remember how many applicants, but it was a lot of them. And Steve was able to retro Accelitas's score and then send that back to us. And then my team took that score and compared it to the unknown and the denied populations and said, okay, if you have an Accelitas score above X, we are going to remap you to effectively a workflow that doesn't require step-up authentication. And the beauty of that is when somebody is step-up authenticated, whether it be through knowledge-based authentication or ID document verification, they have a much lower likelihood of conversion. I think Jimmy mentioned that. So when we are able to move people from a step-up authenticated flow to a non-step-up authenticated flow, our conversion rate jumps by, I think it's 10 to 20%. When you revive something, it's a little bit scary. And what we found was actually when Accelitas said that something was good when one of our other providers did not, Accelitas was correct. And what that allowed us to do is really, I mean, I don't want to give the exact number, but it's millions in profit that we are, and it's pure profit because these would have been denials otherwise. So we're bringing them back. They have a higher conversion rate and they are performing fabulously. And then in addition to that, as Jimmy and Steve mentioned, we created a feedback loop. And I think the feedback loop is one of the most important parts of any, really any product, because it allows the Accelitas team to leverage their domain knowledge to make the score that they return to me better. And so through this iterative process, my score gets more and more tuned to my population. And if my population starts to shift, that's, again, with the feedback loop, it will be picked up on Steve's side, and he can make the necessary adjustments to that. Steve, do you want to add anything? I think that's more or less my problem statement and what we did.
Yeah, no, you got it right. I mean, I think the one thing that, is unique about this is like how much data has been shared between the different organizations to make this a successful product both ways. So, you know, Ryan being willing to kind of go deep into his work stream and allow us to understand it really well has allowed us to make the product work really well in his use case, like you mentioned. So that was something that's kind of critical to make this work.
I would just add that that's a big part of our culture here is, I think everyone on the sales team would say that part of our mantra is we can put some pretty beautiful slides together and we can tell you some stuff, but actually testing, doing a retro test, and then working with us, we want our customers to know how it's going to perform and not wonder how it's going to perform. So that working together, that closeness of relationship, that understanding the problem and the testing and fine tuning is a big part of I think the success story here with you guys. So,
and I do think, Jimmy, you guys are different in that the feedback loop is a very important part. Steve actually was the one who said, let's do that. I had not thought about doing that. So it's, I don't think it's common knowledge that a feedback loop is an ideal scenario really for any type of product, but this one in particular.
Cool. No, that's awesome. Thank you again for that. And Ryan, we love working with you, and thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it. So, so as we wrap up, and I want to leave time for questions here, just want to say that we're really proud, really excited to be pioneering in this space. There's a lot that we've done and a lot that we're still doing to really kind of change this world, because it seems like overall that some of the core issues we talked about here are ones that just been out there for such a long time. And as a sales guy, being able to go into client relationships like we did with Ryan and know that in every single scenario, you're still getting an, oh, wow. Every single time is just a great way to go to work every day. So, so thank you for that. So with that, we want to leave some time for some questions to the group. So Let's take a look and see if there's any questions in the queue.
So Jimmy, I'll ask you, the first question is, what is the process for implementing database verification for bank account validation?
Steve, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think Ryan mentioned it, kind of how he started, where we talk about starting with a retro, so we can take your existing data, what you're doing right now, and what the performance is, and we can go back to that point in time and say, what would our service have done? And that's kind of the first step towards understanding the benefits of our service. And then we'll kind of dig into, like we did with Ryan, we can dig into your use case and how, what your scenario is, whether you want it at the top of the waterfall or bottom of the waterfall as a fill-in and so on. And then kind of prove that out in production. So retros are always taken with a grain of salt. We try to make them as precise as possible. But the real step is to, hey, we'll take it and make sure that what we tell you in retro is going to happen also in production.
How close is your retro test to the final implementation?
I can handle that one too. So it improves over time, I guess would be the answer. We try to make it as close as possible. With any simulation, if there's going to be some minor differences, especially when we're dealing with the real-time aspect of the data at that particular point in time when the application is seen, what is happening, so that there's some limitations on that. But for the most part, since we've done so many of these, we've optimized, what we see and what's reliable and what's not, and so we have high precision on, what we see in the retro versus what we predict to be in production.
And I can actually add to that too, Steve. I know that you and I went back and forth to verify that the distribution that we saw in the retro of the score matched what we saw in production.
Right.
And so obviously that's an important part. And I will say that your score, we used the retro to come up with the thresholds, and we ran it in production, and the distribution that we saw in the retro matched what was in production. And so
awesome.
Solid.
We have a question specifically for Ryan. Have there been any challenges with data changing inside of COVID before or after? And have you found interesting ways to adjust for that?
I wouldn't necessarily say the data is changing. I think COVID sort of shifted the population of individuals that want, in our case, to get a lease with us. We are seeing people want things to be digital and want them to happen now. So I think that we have been focusing quite a bit on response times, so real-time decisions for both bank account verification and our final decision. But yeah, COVID has changed a lot of things, and I think that it has put the focus more on digital identity verification, whether that be through a product similar to Accelitas, where you're using bank account verification as sort of a proxy for identity verification, but also as bank account verification itself. I don't know if that necessarily answered the question. It was sort of a long one, but I mean, the short of it is COVID changed a lot, and I actually think it might have been for the better. I think that companies are starting to care about their customers more and giving them more options post COVID.
Well, I think for what it's worth, I mean, obviously since there's been a shift of consumer behavior, they're kind of forced to, right? I mean, I think the reality is people need to give a better user experience for those people, because maybe they lost an in-person customer but gained somebody who's a digital customer. Any more questions, Poppin?
Yeah, I'll open this one up to the floor as well. What is the coverage for the new product, and what percentage of banks you see represented in that data?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So what we see is 98% coverage of U.S. financial institutions as well as Canadian financial institutions. So it's a very strong coverage ratio comparative to some of the numbers we talked about here. So that's part of the reason that we've seen such a high degree of success, is that that number is constantly tested, and just the by looking at where those accounts are used, you're picking up a much larger swath of them.
Jimmy, can you touch a little bit more on the Nacha web debit rule and when the enforcement will go into effect?
Yeah, so the enactment of the rule was last March. However, they delayed enforcement of that rule until this March, and I believe it's March 18th or 19th of 2022. So, it really does require, and the reason for the extension largely was COVID, to give people an opportunity to look for, identify, and implement a commercially reasonable effort or solution rather for fraud mitigation, fraud screening. So if you're not already looking for something, in essence, you're already out of compliance based on the letter of the regulation. But as far as enforcement, it is March of 2022 when that begins.
And just to quickly circle back to the database verification for bank account validation, are there any other insights that can provide?
I'll start this and I'll let the team provide, but I think that having that real-time data that's associated with spend at merchants and billers and utilities and things along those lines is just really, really helpful to provide indicative information to help you whether you are a lender or whether you are a business solution provider or a biller or perhaps a utility, to simply just know that the account is valid. Hey, that's great. That's a pretty low bar. But to be able to get a lot more information out of that signal that we can provide is just incredibly helpful. So, as Ryan talked about and as Steve talked about, we don't want to just do a retro test with the client. We really want to understand the client's use case, because we can drive and point the solution based on all the additional rich behavioral data. And that's the word I would emphasize, is it's behavioral data that is real time and also over time. That's just tremendously indicative of a number of different solutions. So we have clients who ask us to point this solution or train the solution for a number of different goals, and perhaps Steve can talk about some of those goals.
Yeah. So I think kind of going back to the COVID impact is one of the big ones is conversion, and then how can we look at models that both address conversion by themselves, being data driven, not, we talked previously about friction and how that affects conversion, but even the data itself can kind of be an underlying predictor of conversion, along with, either NACHA compliance, profitability, first payment defaults, those are all kind of, play into what people want to predict. So, that kind of answers some of the different metrics that we, drive our scores to. One thing I wanted to chime into on the database side of things, and it kind of led into the unlabeled data aspect of it, is there's a ton of data, kind of out there. It's not all applicable to ACH payments or bank account validation, but you see a lot of data. And that's, I think, what that kind of gives that a leg up over other types of validation, is that there's tons of data out there. And if you can find a mapping from institution or structure of the account to who's applying, you can leverage that data in unique ways to expand your coverage.
Looks like we have one more question that just came in. For the new set of consumers being identified and approved, are the lease sizes and profit outcomes similar or different to the larger population for consumers you were serving?
Oh.
I guess that's for me. Yeah, so in our case, I assume that question is for me, but the way that we implemented Accelitas was as an additional layer. So when we are bringing these other individuals in, which is what I assume you mean by the different population, when we're bringing those different populations in, we actually have a baseline that we think we're going to hit. So in this case, for the unknown population, that was some low conversion rate because we applied step-up authentication. What we found, though, was when we remapped an unknown to, say, a more positive state, the performance of that was almost identical to the original score from our provider, but the difference is the conversion rate was higher because there wasn't as much friction. So we got similar, if not slightly better performance, and then we got significantly better conversion rates. And obviously, if we make in our case, our merchants happy by approving as many people as we can, they send us more volume. So it's this very positive, vicious cycle, I guess.
Well, I think that just about wraps up our question and answer portion.
Good questions, everybody. Thank you for sticking around and for submitting. Appreciate that. All right. Well, again, thank you to everybody for taking part today. I really hope that this was beneficial and helpful for you. My information is up on the screen if you have any questions. If you have any questions for any of the three of us, I'm happy to direct them to the group. But otherwise, have a great day and appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot, everybody.